This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Today, Revolver is regarded by many fans and critics as the Beatles' greatest album. But it wasn't always that way. When Revolver was released on the 5th of August 1966, it soon became clear that something was different. But few could have predicted that it would one day be regarded as the Beatles' finest achievement. So how did Revolver go from being a bold new Beatles album to becoming, for many, the greatest album they ever made? For many years, if you asked people to name the Beatles' greatest album, the answer was usually Sgt. Pepper. Yet over the last couple of decades, something interesting has happened. Gradually, one list after another has placed Revolver at the top. So, what changed? Did people simply change their minds? Or was there something about Revolver that listeners hadn't fully appreciated? To answer that, we need to forget everything we know about this album today and go back to the summer of 1966. At first glance, the reviews seem encouraging. Record Mirror called it typically Beatlish, typically controversial, and typically revolutionary. Several reviewers immediately recognised Revolver's originality and ambition, but few treated it as the Beatles' definitive achievement. Despite the clickbait headline, Ray Davies, writing in Disc, praised the Beatles for refusing to stand still, although even he admitted there were moments he wasn't completely convinced by. Taken together, these weren't the sort of reviews you'd expect for an album that would eventually be regarded as one of the greatest recordings ever made. They recognised its ambition, but they were still trying to work out exactly what they were listening to, and the critics weren't alone. Among the letters sent to music papers was one from a disappointed fan who admitted, "I was so shocked that I lost all my appreciation of the Beatles' talents." He went on to accuse the Beatles of spitting into the faces of their fans. Strong words, certainly, but they remind us of something that's easy to forget today. Nobody in August 1966 knew what Revolver was going to become. The Beatles were still, in many people's minds, the mop-top stars of Beatlemania. In America, Saturday morning cartoons were still portraying them that way, even as the songs from Revolver began appearing in the series. The image hadn't yet caught up with the music. Meanwhile, inside EMI's Abbey Road studios, producer George Martin and a young engineer named Geoff Emerick were helping to turn those ideas into sounds that nobody had heard before. None of that guaranteed a masterpiece. It simply meant that the Beatles were taking more risks than ever before, and perhaps that's why the first reactions are so fascinating. People recognised something was happening, they just didn't know what it meant.
Paper, get your latest paper.
Is this the latest edition?
Hot off the press, pal.
Are you sure this is all the latest happenings?
Absolutely. Hey, look out!
I demand my money back. There's not a word in here about me accident. Yeah, and now for the latest bulletin from our sponsor.
Whether you're starting a business, building a portfolio, launching a blog, or creating a website for your own project, Squarespace gives you all the tools you need to get online quickly and professionally. You can choose from their wide range of professionally designed templates and customize the layout, fonts, and colors to suit your own style. Everything works beautifully on desktop, tablet, and mobile. And because it's all built into one platform, there's no need to worry about plugins or complicated updates. If you're selling products, memberships, or services, Squarespace also includes secure payment processing, inventory management, and marketing tools. So, if you've been thinking about creating a website of your own, you can get a 14-day free trial at squarespace.com. Then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Parlogram to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Almost 60 years later, I wondered whether a group of first-time listeners would react any differently. So I invited half a dozen high school students who'd already heard Please Please Me, A Hard Day's Night and Rubber Soul to listen to Revolver from beginning to end, without telling them anything about its reputation. One newspaper suggested that Revolver would need several plays before its full qualities became apparent. Almost 60 years later, one of the students reached pretty much the same conclusion.
it's generally important with all of these songs to listen to them again, because listening to it once in this video gives you the perspective of every single song after each other. You need to listen to them outside of this room again to really get a feel for the song, because that's what happened with me. For example, last time I really did not connect well with some of the songs in Rubber Soul, but then after listening and trying them again later, I actually don't find them as bad as I used to in that moment. So I think it's very, very important to actually have this repetition.
Throughout the student series, one comment kept appearing beneath the videos. Just wait until they get to Revolver. That's the one that's really going to blow their minds. To be honest, I suspected Revolver to be the album that would leave them speechless. It wasn't. The students enjoyed Revolver, but it didn't blow them away on a first listen in the same way A Hard Day's Night had. So, what was it about Revolver that people kept coming back to? Well, I don't think there's one simple answer. For me, it begins with the people who made it. By the spring of 1966, everything seemed to come together at once. John was becoming increasingly curious about what songs could be about, and just as importantly, what records could sound like. Paul was writing some of the strongest melodies of his career. George was developing into a more confident songwriter, whose interests stretched far beyond conventional pop music. While Ringo had become an exceptionally imaginative drummer, whose playing was now every bit as inventive as the songs themselves. Then there were two more people, producer George Martin and a young recording engineer named Geoff Emerick. Martin understood music. Emerick understood the studio. Together, they had the experience and confidence to turn very unconventional ideas into reality. Listening to Revolver today, it's easy to think the Beatles were simply experimenting for the sake of it. Reading Geoff Emerick's account in this book, I don't think that's what was happening at all. Time after time, John, Paul or George arrived with an idea that couldn't be achieved using conventional recording techniques. Emerick's job wasn't to invent effects, it was to solve problems. One of the things that gets me about Revolver is that almost every song presents a new challenge. It was also tackling subjects the Beatles had barely touched before. Loneliness, tax, death, childhood, Indian philosophy and altered consciousness. Take Eleanor Rigby. Paul didn't want a rock band, he wanted a string octet. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the sound was. Instead of placing the microphones at the regulation distance, as EMI normally preferred, Geoff Emerick moved them much closer to the instruments. In classical recording, that simply wasn't done. The result was a string sound unlike anything people had heard on a pop record. Nearly 60 years later, it still sounds remarkable. Then there's Got to Get You Into My Life. The brass section isn't treated like a traditional brass section at all. It's recorded more like an electric guitar. The huge amount of compression punches through the speakers with an energy that simply wasn't heard on pop records at the time. The Beatles imagined the impossible. George Martin translated the ideas into musical terms. Geoff Emerick found a way of making them happen. Without any one of those ingredients, Revolver would have been a very different album. And nowhere is that clearer than on Tomorrow Never Knows. Today, it's regarded as one of the most influential recordings the Beatles ever made. But when John Lennon first described what he wanted, it must have sounded impossible. He told George Martin he wanted his voice to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop. There wasn't a button on the mixing desk for that. According to Emerick, the first attempt involved suspending a microphone from the ceiling of Abbey Road's famous echo chamber. The result wasn't convincing. So ignoring EMI's rulebook, Emerick fed John's voice through the rotating speaker of a Leslie cabinet, normally used with a Hammond organ. The effect was unlike anything heard on a Beatles record before. But John's voice was only part of the story. Inspired by the first night's work on Tomorrow Never Knows, Paul went home and stayed up all night creating tape loops, returning the next day with a little plastic bag full of them. Before long, every spare tape machine in Abbey Road had been pressed into service, as George Martin and Geoff Emerick mixed the tape loops live. There was no computer to synchronize everything, no undo button, just a room full of tape machines and people trying to create a sound that had never existed before. Listening to Revolver today, what strikes me isn't just the creativity behind these ideas, it's the confidence. Every song sounds as though the Beatles knew exactly what they wanted to achieve, even if there wasn't an obvious way of achieving it. And that's why I think Revolver feels so different. Each Beatle was becoming more individual, yet those individual voices still combined to create something unmistakably Beatles. So how did Revolver become the Beatles' greatest album? For years, the title of the Beatles' greatest achievement was given to Sgt. Pepper. Revolver almost seemed to disappear into the background. But over the years, something else changed. Sgt. Pepper never became a lesser album. Its place in musical history is secure. For those who lived through 1967, it wasn't just an album. It was part of a cultural movement that changed popular music forever. But as the years passed, new generations came to it without that experience. They weren't hearing The Summer of Love or the shock of its release. They were simply listening to the music. And on that basis, many began to hear Revolver differently. Many fans still list the White Album as their number one, but it's a different kind of record. Part of its appeal lies in hearing four increasingly individual Beatles pursuing their own ideas. On Revolver, those same individual voices were still united by a common purpose. I first bought this copy of Revolver when I was 15 years old, and it still gives me the same feelings today as it did back then. One of the things that's always fascinated me about Revolver is that it's unmistakably an album of 1966, yet it never sounds dated. It still feels fresh and has a unique sound that, although many artists have tried to recreate it, very few have managed to capture. To me, it wasn't just the experimentation, it was the confidence, the creativity, and the musicianship. This was 6 people, all working together at an extraordinary level, each pushing each other to the top of their game. Whether Revolver is the greatest Beatles album is for each of us to decide. Some will always choose Sgt. Pepper, others Abbey Road or the White Album. But if making this video has taught me anything, it's that Revolver didn't earn its reputation overnight. The critics in 1966 sensed something unusual had happened. My students sensed it too. They just couldn't explain it yet. Perhaps that's how Revolver became the greatest Beatles album. I really hope you enjoyed our look at this magnificent album. Let me know in the comments what it means to you. I'll be back next weekend with something else. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now, and thanks for watching.